Good afternoon. Good afternoon, and welcome to another extremely topical and extremely timely and exciting AMET webinar. As we are watching the results of yesterday's American election returns come in on this side of the Atlantic, we're analyzing last week's election returns in Israel. On Tuesday, November 1st, the Israeli citizenry went to the polls and the right-wing bloc won 64 out of 120 seats, giving them a 20-seat advantage over the remainder of the Knesset, the Israeli parliament. This is perhaps the most solid right-wing coalition in any Israeli government. Unfortunately, in many circles of the talking classes and the self-proclaimed literati and American virtue signalers, this election is being perceived in nothing short of apocalyptic terms. This is best exemplified by Thomas Friedman, who wrote a column for Friday's New York Times entitled, quote, "The Israel We Knew Is Gone," where he describes the democratically elected government as, quote, "a rowdy alliance of ultra-Orthodox leaders and ultra-nationalist politicians, including some outright racist and anti-Arab Jewish extremists, once deemed completely outside the norms and boundaries of Israeli politics." He goes on to write, "A fundamental question will roil American synagogues. Do I support this Israel or not support it?" We could not possibly be in better hands to be able to answer some of these allegations and doomsday scenarios about Israeli democracy than to speak with our dear friend, Alex Trayman. Alex is a brilliant political analyst, writer, and thinker. He is the managing director and Jerusalem bureau chief of a wonderful publication, jns.org, and has his finger on the pulse of absolutely everything that's happening within Israel, and particularly within the Israeli Knesset. He's written scores and scores and scores of articles and has directed and produced major films and that have been highly acclaimed, such as Iranian and Honor Diaries. And it is a profound pleasure for me whenever we have Alex on, who is a wonderful, wonderful friend. So first of all, Alex, let's try to get beyond the histrionics. The Likud received 32 seats. The right wing showed a 20-seat advantage.
I just want to step in before you ask the question on that point. So after the final tabulations, the right wing got 64 seats. They had an 18-seat advantage over the left wing. But in terms of the parties that didn't want Netanyahu to be the prime minister, it was 64 to 56. Wow. So
great.
Go ahead.
Great. This is why we love you.
But it's important because it's actually important because you see in the left wing that they say that the right wing basically got only won the election by 30,000 votes or so. Yeah. It's not true because they're combining the left wing plus all the Arab sectors, some of which will never sit in any Israeli government and never have. And they're two separate segments, political segments of the society. But between Israel's right wing and its left wing, it was 64 to 46. It was basically a landslide win right over left. Go ahead. Right.
So why do you think the vast majority of Israeli citizens have moved sharply to the right?
Well, I don't think that the people moved all of a sudden sharply to the right. Israel's been a center-right country for many, many years. And if you look back at all of the election cycles, when you counted the votes of parties that campaigned as being to the right of the political center, you always had a majority. But the problem was that not all the members of Israel's right wing wanted to sit with Premier Benjamin Netanyahu. So you had this blocking phenomenon where in multiple elections, and it really started with Avigdor Lieberman of the Russian Yisrael Beitenu party. You know, these Russians are very right wing, but he wanted to take Netanyahu down and basically resigned from a Netanyahu-led government, and then refused to sit with him, following that first election when everybody had assumed that he was going to sit with him. And that is what started to cause this cycle of electoral standoffs. And then once he did that, then that gave incentive for other members of the right wing to challenge Netanyahu, like Gideon Sa'ar, who had challenged Netanyahu in one of the election cycles as the head of the Likud party. He was trounced in a primary. Then he broke off from Likud, formed his own party, took 6 members of the Likud with him, ran on this new party called New Hope, and then took his members of Knesset and aligned with the left. And Naftali Bennett and his partner Ayelet Shaked did the same thing. They formed a party called Yamina. They used to be part of the religious Zionists, and we'll talk about them in a couple of minutes, but they broke off from the right-wing nationalist camp. They created like a soft right party. They campaigned to the right. They said that they were going to sit with Netanyahu. They strengthened them. But ultimately, in the end of the day, they went ahead and they joined up with the left wing to create this last government, this change government, which was it was basically brought every single left-wing member of Knesset from the backbenches of the opposition into the government, into some of the significant, most powerful ministries, including the Ministry of Defense, including the Foreign Ministry, the Ministry of Energy and Transportation and Health, and several others, culture and more. They also brought, for the first time in Israeli history, an Islamist party representing the Arab Israeli public, the Ram party, which is actually affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood, into the government, because without them, they wouldn't have been able to form a government. And so together you had this strange alignment of every member of Israel's left wing, plus an Islamist party, plus a handful of right-wing defectors that formed the most narrow 61-seat blocking majority on Netanyahu, and they hope to rule like that. Oh, and by the way, they actually, since Lapid, who was the largest party in that alignment, Yair Lapid, who was challenging Netanyahu in this election, he couldn't emerge as the prime minister, so he cut a deal whereby Naftali Bennett would start as the prime minister. And Naftali Bennett had received only 7 seats in the election, and then joined this left-wing government. From the first moment, one of his own party members refused to join. So he went down from 7 seats to 6 seats. So you had somebody with less than 5% of the electoral support becoming the Israeli prime minister. And that's very important because it's a tremendous subversion of the democratic process. And you had a majority of people in each one of these elections until now that voted for a center-right government. But it took 5 cycles for Israel to break through the electoral standoff, because ultimately what's very important to understand in Israel is that Israelis don't pick the prime minister. It's the parliamentarians that choose the prime minister. So what happened is, in 5 different elections, every member of parliament basically showed their stripes, and Israelis got to finally see who's really wants a right-wing government and who would be willing to take the right-wing mandate and to gift it over to the left. And so after 4 inconclusive cycles, finally Israelis figured it out that if we want a right-wing government, it has to be for a specific small set of parties. And they did vote overwhelmingly for those sets. And that enabled the right wing and Netanyahu to get over 64. Another of the key factors was voter turnout. Right. And Israel had very high voter turnout. We had over 70% of the eligible electorate casting votes, which was the most in any election since 1999 and more than in any of these other 5 cycles. So a lot of pundits here are saying, Israelis are tired of elections. They're not going to show up. They don't want to do this anymore. No, Israelis said, we're going to solve this problem. We're going to get out and we're going to make sure that we overcome the egos of these parliamentarians that simply refuse to recognize the will of the electorate, and to make sure that the proper parties get the seats. And sure enough, in all of the areas that could have gone to the right wing, you saw very, very high voter turnout. And in more left-wing areas, you had equal voter turnout to to the previous election. So in this fifth election cycle, it wasn't a question of, could I convince somebody who's left wing to be right wing, or could I convince somebody who's right wing to vote left wing? No, it's just a question of who's going to come out in force to vote. And people who wanted a right wing government came out in force to vote and to make sure that we would end this election standoff once and for all.
So without calculating the jockeying for seats within the parties, and it is such a very, very different system than what we're used to in America. What's the distinction in terms of just the popular vote between those that voted for left-wing parties and those that voted for right-wing parties?
Right. So basically, you have 120 members of Knesset, which you have a proportional parliamentary system. So you basically take 100% and you divide it into 120. So 64%, it means, now we have so many parties in this Knesset. I think there's I just have to count, sorry, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 parties made it in. Okay, there's 11 parties in this Knesset. So the idea that you would have, it's not like two-party system where one party is going to get over 50% and the other party below. It's not you don't get a majority, you get a plurality. And then it's up to the larger parties to form coalitions with smaller parties to get over that hump and be able to form a majority coalition so that you can pass votes. So the right wing got 64 votes out of 120. So that's probably, what is that, 52% of the popular vote, something like that. And then the left wing only got 46, which is probably, a little under 40% of the vote. And then you had the Arab parties, 2 Arab parties got 10 seats. But then another piece of the story was also, you have something in Israel called the electoral threshold. It means that you can't get into the Knesset at all unless you get 3.25% of the votes, which is approximately equivalent to 4 seats. So that means if you don't get 4 seats, then you get 0 seats and you're out. And so 2 things happen also that help the right wing tremendously, is that the furthest left party in the spectrum, the Meretz party, which has been in Knesset for decades, failed to cross the electoral threshold for the first time. So the most progressive party and a mainstay in Israel's Knesset is now for the first time out. And one of the Arab parties defected from a joint list of Arab parties in the last government and tried to run on its own. And they also failed to cross the threshold. So that collectively, they took about like 200,000 votes that would have preferred Netanyahu not be the prime minister. And those votes simply got discarded because of the way the system works with the electoral threshold.
Right.
Perhaps,
right. I'm sorry, go ahead. Right.
I said perhaps Netanyahu would have formed the government anyway, but having those like 4 seats that Meretz party, for example, was expected to get, those 4 seats come off the left, and then all of the rest of the seats get redistributed, and essentially at least 2 of them will go to the other side when you divvy up the mandates.
So do you see this as a response to some of the radical extremism of the post-Zionist left? I mean, there are people, who I know who refuse to sing Hatikva, when most Israelis are proud patriots and proud to serve in the IDF, or perhaps it was a response to what happened in the war of May of 2021, when there was an insurrection of Israeli Arabs in places like Lod and Ramla and Haifa and Jaffa. What do you think the underlying societal trends are that made people, vote for a series of right-wing parties?
You're absolutely right. It's important to note that the left wing has been declining in political power here for really since the signing of the Oslo Accords in 1993. The Labor Party, which used to be the long-staying ruling party of Israel, got barely 4 seats in this election. The Meretz party, which had previously had as many as 6 or 7 seats, even more in previous cycles, now has 0 seats. And So the left wing has been dying a slow and steady, steady decline. They've been declining very steadily, and that is because Israelis recognize that the Oslo process is a failed process. And fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. We've given away land, like we've withdrawn from Gaza Strip as a test case for what that might look like if we would create a Palestinian state in Judea and Samaria, and it was an utter failure. So there's no way that we're going to go ahead with that on a grander scale in the current conditions. So the left wing doesn't have too much to sell to the Israeli public in terms of diplomacy. They are more socialist in their mentality. And in the last several years, Netanyahu as prime minister, being prime minister for 15 years, being finance minister in between for a few years as well, has really opened up the free market. And even though Israelis do like socialized medicine and it can work here, and they like cheaper universities, and there's certain elements that Israelis do like, but relatively speaking, Israelis like the free market and they like capitalism, and they want bureaucracy slashed. And so I think both in terms of security and diplomacy, and also in terms of economics, the right wing has a big advantage in the eyes of many members of the Israeli public. And then at the same time, you also have the religious sensitivities. One of the major shifts in Israeli politics over the last decade or so is that today the traditional and religious parties all sit on the right, and the staunchly secular parties all sit on the left. And it didn't used to be like that. You used to have, secular right wing, and used to have left wing parties that, were respectful of tradition. And today you have this new divide. But it's the religious members of the public which are outpacing the secular members of the public in terms of births per mother and birth rates. So the population is growing on the right, and the population on the left is not growing as fast.
Right. So getting back to something you mentioned, as this being almost a referendum on Oslo, or not even a referendum, it's just like gradually, I think most Israelis, even Israelis on the left, have said to me, there's no one to talk to, we've just, been besieged with missile attacks, since the Gaza withdrawal in 2005. Yet we have Joseph Biden as our president, at least for another 2 years. And there is almost a mythology that has been developed over the 30 years since Oslo throughout the international community of Land for Peace, and that, and it's very hard to get them to budge. And I'm very, very afraid that the election of Netanyahu is going to say, you see, we could have had two states living side by side in peace and democracy. Everything will be hunky-dory. We could all sing Kumbaya, but then there was this right-wing government that was formed, and this is the reason why there's not peace in the Middle East. Do you think Prime Minister Netanyahu, Prime Minister-elect, former Prime Minister Netanyahu, I don't know how you say, will finally have the courage to be able to challenge the premises behind Oslo and the international community and put this to rest and say it's been a failure and we've got to go back to the drawing board and look at a different paradigm?
Yeah, right. In contrast to Yair Lapid, who stood up at the United Nations just last month and said that Israel should go back on the path towards a negotiated two-state settlement with the Palestinians, Netanyahu has not met with Mahmoud Abbas for the last 9 years. And he essentially froze any conversation about a negotiated two-state solution with the Palestinian Authority. And he's not going to reopen that. There's no doubt about it. His coalition, which is going to be for the first time in his 15 years, a exclusively right-wing coalition, will not give him a mandate to do that, and he doesn't want to do that, and he's strong enough to withstand U.S. pressure. But I think it's important to note something that U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Tom Nides, told me in an interview a few weeks before the election, when Yair Lapid was the prime minister and when the Biden administration was hoping that Netanyahu would be blocked once again. He said that we don't have a two-state solution because the two sides don't want a two-state solution. You know, he said we said America can't want it more than Israelis and Palestinians want it, and they don't want it. So, you know, they'll try to heap the blame on Netanyahu. I don't doubt that for 1 second, but the reality of it is that the Palestinians don't want it. And the Israeli public does not want to cede territory to Palestinians, given that Palestinians continue to incite to terror. They continue to finance terror by paying stipends to terrorists sitting in Israeli prisons and to the families of martyrs who die in the act of first-degree murder. And so they haven't paved the pathway towards peaceful coexistence. And when I interviewed Prime Minister Netanyahu, that former prime minister at the time, just 2.5 weeks ago, he told me, he said the Palestinians don't want peace with Israel. He said the Palestinians want peace without Israel. He said they don't want a state sitting alongside Israel. They want a state instead of Israel. So, you know, the Israelis, we live here. Okay. We are in the neighborhood. We know who our neighbors are, and we understand what's happening here. And there's no way that that this government is going to make even one step towards giving the Palestinians a state in the biblical homeland of Judea and Samaria. At the same time, it doesn't mean that we can't work to improve quality of life, upward mobility, make life better for Palestinians, many of whom understand that their opportunities to live a better quality life are immensely greater under Israeli sovereignty than they would be if Israel would cede from the territory. Mm-hmm. If Israel wouldn't be here, or if the Palestinians would have a state in Judea and Samaria, that state would look like Syria. That state would look like Lebanon. You know, that state would look like Egypt. It would look like Gaza. And we all know what that looks like. And Palestinians themselves don't want it. They know that the Palestinian Authority is corrupt, a kleptocracy that doesn't have their own interests in mind, that they're only perpetuating a conflict with Israel because there's an industry of perpetuating the conflict, which takes billions of dollars and pours it into Ramallah and into the coffers of the Palestinian Authority. So that's why they perpetuate a conflict. But most Palestinians understand. They see that they're living in the startup nation, and they understand that their opportunities for their GDP and their standard of living to go up is much greater under Israeli sovereignty. And really what we need is for the international community to just acknowledge that, which is readily apparent to anybody who lives here.
Right. To try to get that message translated across the ocean is very important. I mean, there have been some pieces of legislation that, Hussein and I have worked very, very hard on. And then all of a sudden we find, something tapped onto it, it has that have nothing whatsoever to do with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And of course, we believe in two states living side by side in peace and democracy. So this is a regnant part of the mythology. It's almost become a religion here. And this is it's a very, very sad. This past Monday, Prime Minister Netanyahu began the all-important job of trying to form a government. What is it? He has 42 days in which to do that, according to the law.
So according to the law, he has 28 days. And if he cannot form the government within 28 days, but is clearly in the advanced negotiations, then he can request a 14-day extension to form the government. But I don't think it's going to come to that. I actually think that there's a great chance that this government can come together within 2 weeks' time.
So how is he going to deal with figures such as Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich and that coalition? They did have a rather large showing, but Prime Minister Netanyahu has to walk a very delicate balancing act between these domestic concerns and the public face of Israel to the international community. How will he deal with such strong figures on the right?
Well, first of all, there's only four parties in this coalition, which is it's actually a small government by comparison in terms of the number of parties and the number of interests there. Each of these parties has their own distinct interests, which for the most part don't compete, but complement the interests of the other parties. So in terms of what the demands are, it's pretty easy for Netanyahu, who is the master of the political parliamentary system here, to figure out. I mean, it's going to be a negotiation. This is the period of the horse trading, but by and large, Netanyahu should be able to walk a balancing act. Now, for Netanyahu, yes, there's pressure from the international community, and he'll have to deal with that. There's going to be pressure from the international community, no matter what he does or doesn't do. And for Netanyahu, who has tried to govern really since 2018 without a stable government, the most important issue for Netanyahu is stability, and he will give the parties and the leaders of those parties what they want in order to create a stable government that has the potential for the first time in a long time to actually last a full term. So Itamar Ben-Gvir, for example, on the eve of the election, he demanded that he would get the public security ministry because he campaigned on issues of public security. And if you actually look at what he's talking about in terms of public security, those issues resonate with Israeli voters, and that's actually the primary reason why his party surged to 14 seats and became the third largest party. So Netanyahu can turn around to the Biden administration and say, how on earth can I not give the third largest party, the ones that are recommending me to be the prime minister, the ministry that they request in the negotiations? Like Netanyahu doesn't have a mandate to not give him what he wants. They brought him 14 seats, which was well above what they were polling at several weeks before. They were one of the reasons why Netanyahu was able to form a government. So he will give him the public security ministry, and they will have to deal with the fallout.
Right. But we know that many left-wing groups, particularly left-wing Jewish groups, have been wringing their hands that this new government will be racist. And, Itamar Ben-Gvir is certainly, he had been a former member of Kach, Kahana Chai. He has said some rather radical things. And they will claim that or they will say that we can no longer claim that Israel is our only democracy in the Middle East. How would you respond to these sorts of criticisms?
Yeah, first of all, I mean, in terms of the democracy, now what's happening is that we know that progressives do a lot of wordsmithing, okay, and they change definitions, they invent new terms that we have to look up, and like what does that mean? Like we didn't, like, what's critical race theory, what's intersectionality? We didn't even know what those things were. We had to look them up. And what they're doing is that they're wordsmithing, and they are flipping the word progressive for democratic, which means that if the government here is anti-progressive, because they're against the progressive wave that the left has tried to bring through Israel, and this election result was a challenge to that progressive wave. So this government's anti-progressive. So instead of saying that the government's anti-progressive, they say it's anti-democratic. Okay, now the people that are saying that this government is racist, and that's very dangerous. I'm going to get to that in a second, but they had no problem when Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid partnered with the Ram Party, led by Mansour Abbas, who has been a prisoner in Israeli prison, and that party is affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood, and supports ostensibly Hamas. Like, they had no problem with that. Why? First of all, they call that diversity, okay? But why did they not have a problem with it? Because that empowered the left, which had about 35 seats, in the 120 seat Knesset, was brought into the halls of power because of the partnership with Ram. So they were willing to, so Democrats and progressives in America and around the world were willing to roll out the red carpet to the most diverse government in Israeli history in order to allow a terror affiliated organization into the government. Here, it is true that Itamar Ben-Gvir is basically a student of the philosophies of Meir Kahane, who himself was a Knesset member and was banned from Knesset. But Ben-Gvir told me in an interview that this was his days of activism when he was a teenager and a young adult, and he recognizes the boundaries of what that philosophy preached and versus how you have to behave in realpolitik and what actually happened. So he has openly acknowledged that he has moderated his positions, and his statements throughout this campaign have been a lot more moderate. He just appealed in an op-ed in Israel Hayom, which you can also read in JNS, to members of the left wing to really give him a chance, because really the only thing that he cares about is security. And with relation to the issues of security in this last government, we've had tremendous breakdowns in security, and terrorism is on the rise significantly. The rules of engagement for police officers and soldiers have just gotten stricter and stricter, making it more difficult for soldiers and police officers to open fire in very dangerous situations, actually often putting their own lives or the lives of Israeli civilians at risk in order to, not make the wrong judgment call in the heat of the moment. And so Ben-Gvir wants to make those rules of engagement looser. He wants to give police officers and soldiers immunity so that if they do in the heat of the moment make a decision that in retrospect, when you can play Monday morning quarterback on that maybe that he should have waited, or that police officer or that soldier won't go to prison, for that. Like, we're dealing with life and death. So, these are some of the things that Ben-Gvir wants. He also, wants to make the conditions in Israeli jails tougher for terrorists. I mean, terrorists sit in Israeli jails in bunks with all of their buddies, with their cell phones, watching TV, getting 3 meals a day, studying for university, getting PhDs, taking meetings, having their wives come over for visits. And he said, it's basically like a badge of honor for terrorists to sit in Israeli jails, and he wants to make it not a badge of honor for terrorists to sit in Israeli jails. So there's a lot of policies that he's been communicating, which resonate on a common sense level with a lot of Israelis. And like I said, Netanyahu he's gonna give him that ministry most probably, and yeah, he's gonna face a lot of criticism for that, but because the left wing wanted Yesh Atid and Yair Lapid to be the prime minister, that they wanted a left-wing government. They didn't get it, so they're going to attack Netanyahu. And guess what? It might as well be on Itamar Ben-Gvir, because if it's not on that, it's going to be on something else.
Right. All right. Let's switch to another issue, and that is there's a very, very different way of selecting justices in the Israeli Supreme Court than there is in the United States. And can you, first of all, discuss the issue of the justice system in Israel and how it's composed, and that the fact that there are some people who feel that the Supreme Court is one of the issues underlying this election?
Right. So the people that are attacking the right wing, as being anti-democratic, the first issue that they point to is that they want to curb the powers of Israel's Supreme Court. And they think that is a subversion of justice, a subversion of democracy. But what people that read these articles don't necessarily understand is that in Israel, you don't have a system of checks and balances like you have in the United States. In the United States, a sitting president nominates a candidate to be a Supreme Court justice, and then that nominee has to pass through a Senate hearing it has to be approved by the Senate. So the only way you become a Supreme Court justice is if you go through the executive branch and the legislative branch. And over time, Republicans pick some of the justices and Democrats pick some of the justices. And many times when they do that, the Senate might not be from the same party, which means that if a Republican picks a candidate and there's a Democratic Senate, they're going to pick a moderate candidate in order to make sure that that candidate passes through the Senate confirmation hearing. So by and large, you have in the U.S. system, you have justices that represent both the Republican and the Democratic point of view, and it's not homogeneous selection. And then the Supreme Court in the United States, has to, rules on the basis of a constitution. So there's a document that is the foundational document, and there's definitely room for interpretation. What did the founding fathers mean? And there's debate about it, but there's a constitution there that they can't rule out of bounds of the Constitution. And also they can only hear cases with standing, where somebody brings standing, and only hears cases when that have gone through the lower court system and gone through appeals, and then they reach the Supreme Court. In Israel, the system is entirely different. And the first issue is selection. There is a selection process in Israel for Supreme Court justices. I'm not going to get into all the details of it because we could spend 10 minutes just talking about it. But essentially, the Supreme Court itself and the Bar Association, which are the lawyers of Israel, many of whom want to be on the Supreme Court and are aligned with the Supreme Court, together represent more than half of the selection committee for the next justices. So essentially, there's an almost automatic majority whereby the Supreme Court selects its own successors. The overwhelming majority of Israel's Supreme Court justices, and there's 15 of them, are left-wing, and they are rather homogenous, and they make sure that there's not right-wing candidates coming onto the Supreme Court. The Prime Minister doesn't have any say in who becomes a Supreme Court justice, and the Parliament doesn't have any say in who becomes a Supreme Court justice. So in terms of the selection process, it's radically different than the United States. Second of all, Israel does not have a founding document that is a constitution. And so the Supreme Court can rule based on its own moral judgments as to what should be legitimate laws and what should not be legitimate laws. Now, also since the 90s, and when Aaron Barak was the president of the Supreme Court, he transitioned the Supreme Court into an activist court, a court that could strike down legislation that the parliament passes at any time, okay, based on vote in the Supreme Court. If they say, no, we don't like that law, they can cancel a law. They can turn around and say there's no law dealing with something and basically put a deadline on the parliament to pass a law on a specific issue. They can force the executive branch of the government to take actions like we've seen many times, such as to demolish homes, like Jewish homes in Jewish communities and settlements. So this is an activist court. Also, they take cases without standing, which means that in many cases, they'll have far left NGOs, non-government organizations, that will petition on behalf of a case and go right to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court will say, yeah, we'll rule on that. And then they're able to judge on a specific case, even if there's no plaintiff withstanding. So, the people that actually care about democracy and the right wing is saying, we want judicial reform. We want the Supreme Court to be held in check. We want there to be real checks and balances, and we want the selection process to be more fair and more diverse for the legislature and for the executive branch to have a say in that. And we don't want this. We don't want the Supreme Court to be a super legislative body. So but it's very convenient for left wingers or Democrats and others to look at this right wing coalition and say that they're anti-democratic because they want to change some of the processes involved in the Supreme Court.
It's so ironic because democracy has spoken in Israel, and the Supreme Court should be able to reflect the will of the people.
Israel's a hyper democracy. We're not
Right.
anti-democratic. We're
Right.
too democratic. Well, that's why we have 5 elections. And look around the neighborhood. How many other countries are holding other elections like that? And if the parliamentarians can't figure it out, the mandate goes back to the people and we have another election. So, this is a hyper democracy. We have how many I said 11 parties in the current Knesset. Like it's very
It's a
democratic.
raucous democracy, right? Loud and raucous. So the huge overriding question facing Israel, the United States, the Gulf nations, the free world is Iran. And we've seen over the past 2 months, actually even longer, but starting with Amani, who actually had a few hairs showing from her hijab. There have been thousands and thousands of demonstrators on the streets of Iran. I have to tell you, Alex, I am so sorely disappointed in our mainstream media in the United States that hardly covers this at all. There have been the Basij and the IRGC, have been brutal, and have killed hundreds of demonstrators on the streets, or they've carted them off to Evin prison in Tehran to be tortured and, never heard from again. Plus, Iran is now selling drones to the Russians. Yet it seems as though there are many people, just as there are many people that are absolutely set on the mythology of a two-state solution, set on the mythology of negotiations with Iran without any plan B. And Israel is always on the front lines, as they are really America and the West's one outpost of Western democratic values, and they're right there. Do you believe that Prime Minister Netanyahu will respond any differently to the Iranian threat than Yair Lapid or Naftali Bennett did?
Well, you'll remember that Benjamin Netanyahu marched into Congress and gave an address to joint sessions in 2015 when then President Barack Obama was advancing the original JCPOA Iran nuclear deal to stand up and to say that this was a bad deal. It was a bad deal for America and it was a bad deal for Israel. This angered Obama to no end because the Iran nuclear deal was one of his primary foreign policy objectives. And yet, I think it's important to note that when you consider the foundational elements that led to the signing of the normalization agreements with states in the Gulf, which include the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, and then also Saudi Arabia, who basically gave tacit approval for the Emirates and Bahrain to sign these agreements. Netanyahu standing up for the interests of Israel, which were also the interests of these Gulf states, was one of the factors, not the only one, of course, but one of the factors that endeared trust between these Muslim majority nations in the region and the state of Israel, and actually led towards the signing of those agreements. Now, Yair Lapid and his partner Naftali Bennett in the previous government were peddling the idea that Netanyahu has harmed immensely the relationship between Israel and Democrats. And that speech was one of the reasons. And Netanyahu's opposition to the Iran nuclear deal, was one of the reasons for that rift, that growing rift between Israelis and Democrats. And also they pointed to the idea that it didn't work, which is a fallacy, because the next president to come in after Barack Obama was Donald Trump, and one of the first things that he did was to remove America from the JCPOA. So it was Netanyahu's opposition to the JCPOA that ultimately got Trump to withdraw from that deal. Now, it's true that it didn't convince Democrats that it was a bad idea. And so when Biden came into office, they put into place exactly the same team, more or less, that negotiated the first JCPOA and gave them the mandate to sign a second JCPOA. And that became the U.S. foreign policy prerogative again. Now, these protests that are taking place in Iran have been a godsend to Israel because they have demonstrated what we've known for a long time, that this is an illegitimate government, a deeply Islamic fundamentalist regime that doesn't have the interests of its own citizens at hand, and beats them down, from time to time, as they need to do in order to stay in power. And fortunately, the negotiations on a second deal broke down, and we had heard, there was news reports several months back, maybe even in February, that negotiations in Vienna were in advanced stages, and that they were right on the edge of signing a new Iran nuclear deal. And it's Israel's great fortune that that deal has not been signed, and now everybody can see that the Islamic Republic, should not be empowered, should not be given trillions of dollars in sanctions relief and airlifted pallets of cash, for all of their nuclear violations over the last decade plus. And I think that really everything should be done right now to pull the remaining threads out from under this regime and try to get the top of the regime out. It's not only about sanctioning the regime. The purpose of sanctioning the regime is to get the people to overthrow their government and to put in a normal government. So obviously, we hope that Netanyahu will ratchet up pressure once again to sanction the regime, but there might be other things that could be done to further destabilize the regime. And people should remember that when Netanyahu was the prime minister, that there were many acts of sabotage on the Iranian nuclear program, and it was assassination of nuclear scientists. There was the break-in to an Iranian nuclear facility and the airlifting of tons of materials from out and over to Israel. So I don't know. Maybe the Mossad can do some things. I don't have any intelligence there. I'm not like giving away anything, but maybe some things could be done to further destabilize the regime. Netanyahu told me, when I interviewed him, he basically said that he had two objectives that he wanted to accomplish. The first was to end the issue of the Iranian nuclear program, to make certain once and for all that Iran will never cross the nuclear threshold and gain a nuclear weapon. And the second is to make peace with Saudi Arabia and to ultimately end the Arab-Israeli conflict.
Right. And we here at Emet strongly believe that there's a strong nexus between human rights and foreign policy. As the former Soviet dissident Andrei Sakharov has said, if you want to know a country's foreign policy, look at the way they treat their internal dissident population. So one of the things that we are pushing for is whatever can be done to help the protesters on the streets. It's way above my pay grade. I don't know what the CIA is on the ground, but they should be, helping the protesters, giving them small arms, and a way to be able to get through the internet block so that they could communicate with the outside world and with each other. But the regime is very brutal. And, that's one thing about tyrannical autocracies. They will not leave power because of public opinion on the streets. So I think as wonderful icons of the Democratic Party, like David Petraeus and Leon Panetta and Dennis Ross had said way back in December of 2021, without the threat of military force from the United States, the negotiations mean nothing. And, I am hoping that somehow we will be able to make the case, because otherwise it's just basically Israel that's going to be doing the dirty work for the rest of humanity, the way I see it, from the Gulf Arab nations. That's just where we're coming from, personally. So, and in general, how do you think that this election will affect the relationships between Israel and the countries of the Abraham Accords?
I think that the Abraham Accords momentum is going to pick up once again. When the Trump administration and Netanyahu administrations both left office, they both basically said that there was maybe as many as 5 other countries that were waiting to sign on to the Accords. And obviously in the period since the Biden administration has taken office, and since in the year that Netanyahu was basically out of office, a year and a half, we really haven't seen much positive momentum. And I think that that's for a few reasons. One of the reasons is if you look at, once again, the foundational elements of the Abraham Accords normalization agreements themselves, it was that the Palestinian issue was taken and put on the side. And you basically had normalization with Muslim majority countries for the sake of normalization, because of security interests, because of commercial interests, because of technological interests. And what happened was that the veto that the Palestinians had over peace between other countries in the state of Israel was finally removed. And this is the reason why these agreements were able to be signed. And one of the first things that the Biden administration did when they came into office was to bring the Palestinian issue back front and center. So back in February, we had in Israel the Negev Summit, which for the first time brought the foreign ministers of the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, which also signed on to the Abraham Accords, and then also Egypt, which was the first time an Egyptian minister had been in Israel in maybe ever. I don't know. I have to check. Together with, at the time, Foreign Minister Yair Lapid. And yet they also invited Antony Blinken. And so what you had was Lapid and Blinken standing in the middle, flanked by the foreign ministers of 4 Muslim majority nations in the Middle East. And one of the first things that Antony Blinken said at the press conference was that the Abraham Accords were no substitute for peace with the Palestinians. And then you basically had the foreign ministers of each of the 4 Arab countries call in their remarks for there to be a negotiated peace for a 2-state solution, some based on the 1967 line, some didn't specify. But basically, instead of continuing to keep the Palestinian issue on the sidelines, and to demonstrate that normalization could take place and could be beneficial between Israelis and Muslim majority countries, they actually brought the Palestinian veto back front and center. And I think that that's one of the reasons why the momentum has slowed. Now, at the same time, I do want to acknowledge that many commercial agreements have been signed between Israel and the Emirates and Bahrain and Morocco. Like the train has left the station on these normalization agreements, and time will ultimately build the strength of these agreements. But Netanyahu is certainly going to make it a foreign policy priority. And I was in conversation with U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Tom Nides, who was a representative of the Biden administration here, and just this week, and I said, I know you're probably disappointed with the results. And he told me in an interview that the Biden administration will work with whoever is the Israeli prime minister. And Tom Nides was one of the first people to call up to congratulate Netanyahu on being the prime minister, and said that he'd met Netanyahu many times previously and has tremendous respect from Netanyahu. But clearly the Yair Lapid administration was much more closely aligned diplomatic issues than the Biden administration and the Netanyahu administration. And I said, but I want to tell you, I think that you actually have the opportunity to make many more gains with Netanyahu in office. And he said, oh, how so? I said, because you guys are going to double down on the Abraham Accords, and you're going to sign more deals, and you're going to take these accords to a new level that you wouldn't have been able to take with the other administration.
On that cheering note,
I hope you're right.
Okay. On that cheering note, we have just about 5 minutes to turn the mic over to my wonderful colleague, Hussein Abubakar Mansour, who will read some of the questions that came in. I know we've had many, and perhaps pose some of his own. Hussein?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sarah. And thank you very much, Alex, for being with us today. It's a great pleasure to have you always. And thank you very much for all our listeners who tuned in. We're, as you said, we're running out of time, so I'm really apologize that we're not going to be able to get to all the questions that we've received.
We can from my perspective, we can take a few. Don't worry.
Okay, all right, amazing. Well, if we have time, can I post? I'm gonna take our prerogative and ask you a question of my own to start with, and it's more really for asking for a comment. I'm personally, I'm not Israeli. I don't vote in Israel. I support Israel regardless of what happens in Israeli politics. And I met an Israeli friend, more left-leaning, 2 days ago. And the way that basically she described things to me, and I suspect it's the view of a lot of left-leaning Israelis, and I would say even American Jews, is that they almost blame the person of Netanyahu for what they think is a dysfunction of the Israeli political system. You talked about the hyper-democratic behavior of 5 elections in a row, and that basically he's driven by an impulse to avoid corruption charges, to avoid sitting in jail. So he's personally responsible for destabilizing the Israeli electoral system in this way. What can you say about this?
Well, first of all, there's a lot to unwrap in that question.
Right.
Israeli law is explicit that a prime minister, sitting prime minister, can continue to serve while under investigation, while indicted, while under trial, and through a verdict, and even until all appeals are exhausted. So Netanyahu doesn't want an unstable system. He would want a stable system in which he was prime minister for as long as possible. Now, it's important to note that the corruption charges that were brought up against Netanyahu are obscure. There's a Israeli terminology called, breach of trust, which is very loosely defined. That in the case, 2 of the cases that involves Netanyahu trading favors that he was allowed to trade under law in order to receive favorable press coverage, which is something that would never be considered a crime in any democratic society. There was a big paper performed in the UK in, I think, 2012, which looked into this exact issue and found that that British prime ministers, American presidents, Australian prime ministers were routinely trading favors with publishers in order for better coverage in the media. Also, the prosecution acknowledges in many of the instances that Netanyahu never actually even got the better coverage, but just the fact that he was engaging in conversations for better coverage, that they calling this a breach of trust, which is a precedent. Okay, it's not on the Israeli books. They just have basically decided that it should be illegal, and they've assigned the terms breach of trust and fraud to these terms. So these cases would never have been brought to a court of law in the United States or in Britain. That's number one. Number two, even the evidence that was collected only came about through a vast fishing expedition, meaning that nobody had complained about Netanyahu's conduct, but only through searching the phones and computers of people in Netanyahu's circle for things that had not relating to the prime minister's conduct did they even find these issues. The prosecution illegally leaked information about each one of these cases in advance, specifically in the advance of elections, like a week before the first election cycle. Oh, by the way, the attorney general and the state prosecution is investigating Netanyahu for corruption. Just wanted you to know that before we go to elections. And then before the next one, we just want you to know that we're actually going to formally indict Netanyahu, in the weeks after the election. So just wanted you to know that before the election. So they would continue to do that to try to destabilize the electoral system and get voters to not vote for Netanyahu. The prosecution blackmailed several of the state witnesses in order to turn over and become state witnesses, and that that conduct would have been considered a mistrial in the United States on multiple counts. The prosecution actually they named 300 plus witnesses in all of the trials. And if you talk to anybody that know, I'm not a legal expert, but when you speak to legal experts, they suggest that if there was real corruption, that you would need only a handful of witnesses and not 300 witnesses. And the purpose of naming 300 witnesses is because it's going to take years for them to conduct this trial. It's already been over a year. And what that enables is for the media to continuously say that Netanyahu is under trial for corruption over and over and over again, regardless of what the result will be years down the line. And also the court actually made the prosecution amend their charge sheet against Netanyahu on multiple cases already, which also would have been grounds for a mistrial in the United States. So what you see here is that these cases were really intended to get the public to vote Netanyahu out of office. You know, the left wing in Israel's wanted Netanyahu out by hook or by crook. And when they couldn't get him out by hook, they said, well, let's get him out by crook. And they've charged him. And, and the other part of it is that the left accuses Netanyahu, saying that everything that he wants to do is only to keep himself in power, right? This is a common phrase that Netanyahu,
that's exactly what I hear from a lot of those people.
But what people don't acknowledge is that the complicated parliamentary system here is set up in such a way that the opposition is bringing no confidence motions against the government every week, and that members of a coalition can threaten to leave a coalition at any given time. So you have 119 Knesset members that spend their day trying to figure out how to get the top guy out. Okay, so a prime minister, and Naftali Bennett saw this firsthand in the 1 year in which he was the prime minister. You spend and he openly acknowledged it. He said that you spend half of your time trying to put out political fires and stay into power. So when you're in power for so long, you constantly have to fight off those that are trying to get you out of office. So the way the system is set up, you have to do that. And then they use that against him later on and say that the only thing he cares about is staying in power. Sure, that's what he cares about, because if he would stop caring about that for 1 second, he'd be out. So in Israel right now, the popular thing is to call for term limits, right? Because Netanyahu has already been prime minister for 15 years, and there's a good chance he's going to be prime minister now for at least another 4 more years. And that's 19 years. And people turn around saying in a democracy that's just too much. And I think that there's wide agreement that Israel should have term limits. But I think before you can install term limits, one concept that has to be installed is the concept of a term, right? Because just because you get elected doesn't mean you're going to be in office in 6 months from the time you're elected, because anything can happen and your coalition can fall apart at any time. So, if you want to give somebody terms, which would be to Israel's benefit, because why do you want your prime minister dealing with putting out political fires every week? You rather have them working on the very serious security, diplomatic, and economic issues facing the state of Israel, but he winds up spending half of his time just dealing with coalition politics. So if you can give a guy terms where he can, where a prime minister can govern for 4 years, without political instability, and then give the electorate an opportunity to renew that mandate for another 4 years, and now you've given somebody 8 years to be the prime minister, where they were just focusing on moving the country forward. Sure, 8 years, great. Let's turn it over to somebody else. But so if you want to have term limits, first thing you need to have is terms.
Thank you. I just had to make sure that this question in there, because as you said, that this is what a lot of people. It's a point of view of a lot of people, and it deserves to be put out there. Okay, very quickly, some of the questions that we received. Annexation. Is it expected that the religious Zionist parties are going to push Netanyahu to annex the settlements?
Well, I don't think you're going to get any kind of formal annexation without the backing of the United States of America and the international community, because it's going to be an international firestorm if Israel takes a unilateral move of such an extreme nature, that would fundamentally change the status quo that's been in Israel for years, even though most members of the Israeli right and the people that voted in this right-wing government would be happy to see that. What I think is more likely is really just amending the way that Israeli law is conducted in the disputed territories. Now, Judea and Samaria, commonly known as the West Bank, is basically broken up into these three areas: Area A, Area B, Area C. Without getting too deep into the weeds on that, areas A and B are administered by the Palestinian Authority, and Area C is fully administered by the state of Israel. So all the Jewish settlements, for example, are in Area C. All the roads connecting, basically all the communities, including many of the Arab communities, run through Area C, and Israel paves those roads and brings the electricity. And yet, even though Israelis living in Area C, and we're talking about 500,000 plus Israelis, even though they're full tax-paying citizens and they're held to the same legal codes as any other Israeli citizens, they're not governed in the same way. And basically, the defense ministry is responsible. And there's an organization called COGAT, which is basically an organization which governs the territories. And so what I think you're going to see is potentially the amending of COGAT's mandate and the installation of Israeli law over the areas that Israel already administers. So you're just adapting the civil code there, applying Israeli sovereignty in those areas without changing anything on the ground diplomatically.
Thank you. Okay, and then the last question I'm going to ask, I'm going to combine a lot of questions from the audience. It's about the relationship between Israel and diaspora Jews, particularly Jews of the United States. A lot of American Jews are worried because a lot of them have reform and liberal sensibilities, and they are worried about the relationship with Israel's, the issues of conversion, women of the wall, and so on and so forth. Do you foresee any tension in the relationship between Israel and diaspora Jews because of of a certain agenda of religious Zionist parties to deal with these issues?
I think we are seeing increased tension between Israelis and diaspora Jews, and especially in the United States. I think that the media actually feeds that, much of the media, because they are constantly putting a magnifying glass on wedge issues. I know that there are a very small percentage of Jews in the world that care whether there's an egalitarian, at least. Let me change that. There's a very small number of Israelis that care whether there's an egalitarian section at the Western Wall or not. By the way, there happens to be a section there, and it's been for years, and certainly it can be improved upon and made a little bit larger. And but to Israelis, it's a non-issue. And to diaspora Jews, many of whom don't spend more than a couple hours at this section of the Western Wall in a year, if at all. We're talking about, like, in actual usage, very small amount. They turn this into a big issue, and I would wonder how, American Muslims, if they could turn around to Saudi Arabia and say, we expect you to change the codes at your holy sites at the Kaaba in Mecca. This is an administered holy site of the Jewish people. It's run by the rabbinate. Most of the people that go there are Orthodox. Most people that are not Orthodox that go there, don't really seem to mind so much, except you have a few rabble rousers. It's called Women of the Wall. We're talking about less than 100 people. And the diaspora Jewish community is backed by the Reform movement and the conservative movement, turn this into like a huge issue. Like, it's the number one issue in the Jewish world today. Look around, and people should open their eyes. You know how many links to anti-Semitic incidents that I see, taking place in the United States today? Anti-Semitism is dramatically on the rise. Okay, that's an existential issue in the United States. Assimilation is an existential issue to the Jewish people in the United States. Here in Israel, security is an existential issue. Okay, And there's so much room for cooperation between Israel and diaspora Jews on so many of the critical issues. And it is so disappointing that and I don't want to say this about all American Jews, because it's not. American Jews, almost all of them that I meet, whether they're politically conservative or politically liberal, they love and support the state of Israel. But there are leaders in the Jewish communal structure that are promoting a progressive agenda, calling it a Jewish agenda, and they're actually destroying, or at least significantly harming, the relationship between Israelis and Americans. And to what gain? What is the gain on that? Again, there's so much room for commonality, and we have to refocus our attention on what really matters, and figure out what to do to strengthen these two very large and vibrant communities of the Jewish people in Israel and America, and put ourselves onto a common destiny and not tear ourselves apart, which will not benefit anybody.
Well said, Alex. I couldn't agree with you more, and I think it's really, really important for American Jews to look at the big picture. There are Israelis who put their lives on the line every day. Israel does, face a threat of annihilation. And when we see American Jews who feel that they are going to, rip up their affiliation with Israel because of issues such as, expanding the egalitarian prayer space for women at the wall, yeah. I feel it always reminds me of a bunch of ants and an anthill scrambling for a crumb, oblivious to the impending foot about to smash the entire.
And Sarah, and if I may, and I think this is just so important to stress, is that right. Israel is one of, certainly in the Middle East, Israel's the most liberal country, but Israel's one of the most liberal countries in the entire world. Okay. We're literally one of the most liberal, tolerant societies anywhere in the world. And yet somehow or another, and I understand, why maybe radical Islamists do this, but that American Jews would say that we're the oppressors, that, we're becoming racist and right wing. And it's like, yes, we want a right-wing government here because, we've been mugged, we want strong security, because we are a traditional Jewish society, even if we're not, even if the majority is not religious, we're religiously tolerant, and we want, that these traditions to be part of our Jewish culture, and we want to strengthen that. But we're so liberal. Go to Tel Aviv, and people have to remember that. It's very important.
It's so important. It's so important. And, I think American Jews who feel that way should spend time in Israel. Move to Israel if you're unhappy with the electoral system. Put your money where your mouth is. See what it's like to have to, endure a sevod, an attack, and to run into a sealed room before you're so willing to break up your affiliation and your identification with the one Jewish state in the world. I can't thank you enough, Alex. My board has asked me to please, if you like the kind of work that we do in Emet, we're not only have these wonderful webinars each week with brilliant thinkers and analysts such as Alex Trayman from the wonderful jns.org, but we're on Capitol Hill every week trying to fight the good fight. So please, please support us. We know that there are many members of Congress that rely on us and trust us to tell the Emet, to tell the truth. So please go to www.emetonline.org. We really need your support. And please support jns.org for the wonderful work of Alex Trayman and Jonathan Tobin, who we heard from last week, and other brilliant writers. And it is always, always a pleasure to be able to discuss these very, very important issues with you, Alex Trayman.
Sarah, thank you so much. And obviously the work that you're doing at Emet is so important. And yesterday was election day in the United States. And, so there's going to be all new congressmen and staffers, getting into their positions for the first time. And I have no doubt that you're going to be providing a first-rate education for them that will strengthen the U.S.-Israel relationship in very tangible ways. So, keep doing what you're doing. It's so important. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Alex. Always a pleasure. Be well. Bye-bye.